Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I've got a great stream with you all today, and some of my favorite people to talk to about international relations and geopolitics. Today, I'm joined by Raging Mandrill. Hello, how are you?
Doing well on this wonderfully happening Friday afternoon.
And we're joined by Charlemagne. How are you, sir?
I'm good, completely isolated from all happenings that may or may not be happening.
Mm. Well, it's good to kind of be away from the happenings for a little bit. So, for some context, this report that we're going to be reviewing was recently made public earlier this month, and it is a report to the United States Congress from the Department of Defense, as you can see on screen, concerning military and security developments concerning the People's Republic of China. There's always been a large amount of discussion on this channel and on Semiagog, and anytime that we sort of talk about the Pacific. What does it mean with regards to Taiwan? What does the Davidson window mean? Are we ever going to go to war with China? Where's the next big one going to happen? And how convenient that happenings are going on halfway in the Middle East rather than in the Asiatic. But nonetheless, we thought that this report was worth going through and taking through a good look at. Before we start going into any particular sections, gentlemen, what were your main takeaways? I know that you have a lot of notes, Charles. So, what about you? Where do you want to start with your general impressions?
Well, one of the things that stood out to me is the report stated probably like 20 times that COVID-19 had zero effect on China's strategic readiness, which, is not true for the United States. So it kind of seems like the whole coronavirus thing was just a big Chinese op to get America to trip over itself while it could just completely operated normally. So I thought that was interesting how many times that was pointed out.
Mr. Mandrill, any first impressions?
Well, on the COVID front, I thought it was interesting that they actually had a little section on biological weapons and chemical weapons and such. And the interesting thing that I saw with that is that the DoD cannot guarantee, and I'm trying to get the language as close as possible to the actual report here. They can't guarantee that China is in compliance with an international treaty that limits, biological weapons proliferation. So that in connection with the COVID stuff and how often that you perceive, Charlemagne, that was repeated, I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, no, I thought it was particularly interesting that they're willing to acknowledge that. I mean, history pretty much tells us in the past that, uh, we have these biological weapons treaties with the Soviets. We find out after the Soviet Union falls that the Soviets were totally disregarding and not really caring about those treaties and still prepping. We did the same thing, by the way, but it's a diplomatic effort. I guess that's what counts on the world stage, right? So we're gonna go through this, and I've got it up here. It's in the description if you want to read along with it and go through it. But we're just gonna go through and talk about how, per the National Defense Authorization Act of the fiscal year of 2000, we're supposed to be submitting reports on the military and security developments of China and seeing how they're going for the next 20 years, and making sure how we would manage in any potential U.S.-China military-to-military contacts, conflicts, cooperation, and engagement in the future. So quite a bit for us to work with in respects to what we might be seeing. Chapter 1's got probably some of the most interesting stuff, because I always think it's interesting to see how Westerners view Eastern political thinkers, strategists, as well as what the Chinese are doing, because I don't think, as a general gut check for me, outside of a few well-placed logistics people or those that have worked in cooperation or, between, say, the private sector or working with the Chinese market and logistics, that you have a lot of people that know China particularly well. There are not a lot of George Kennans of the world that were just obsessed with Russia and then knew how to talk to the Russians. I don't know if we have too many guys like that who know the Chinese to such an extent. There are a few followers on Twitter I follow that talk about these things, but it always seems odd to me that our State Department will happily send a Senatarian statesman Henry Kissinger to talk to the Chinese rather than any new crop of of there. We have our governors that occasionally visit, like Gavin Newsom of California. Secretary of State Blinken was there not too long ago. So was Senator Chuck Schumer. But most of the American government's attention has been focused on what's happening in Israel. So you have a lot of notes, Charlemagne, for chapter 1. Are there any particular pages or notes that you want me to start bringing up on screen?
Well, I have a few things highlighted in the executive summary.
Oh, sure. Let's start there.
Two of them are just how, the zero COVID policy was abruptly reversed, which took the world by surprise, basically. And, another thing, which I already mentioned, that it didn't affect the People's Liberation Army's combat readiness. So the only other thing I have highlighted is actually at the very end of the executive summary, right before chapter 1. I have all the defense contracts and exchanges in 2022 things highlighted, and I thought that was interesting because basically the PLA is just not talking to, and that's the People's Liberation Army. The Chinese military is just not talking to or cooperating with our military at all. Turning down previously arranged like war games or any other engagements and that sort of thing. And I just think that's interesting to note that they're not talking to us anymore.
Yeah, that is interesting to note because as anybody might tell you, the true mark of hatred is not when somebody's telling you how much they despise you. It's when they stop talking to you.
Yeah, I think this has mainly been spurred on by the last year and a half with respects to Russia and Ukraine, and the sort of rather a unilateral push. I mean, Europe kind of comes along with it if you're more of a buyer into sort of the Europe as a American satrapy state with respects to U.S. foreign policy, but it does illustrate, of course, that the war in Ukraine has pushed Russia, Iran, and China closer together than ever before. There has been multiple conferences between the two presidents and heads of state that say that they share everything. They've done joint military exercises together, that they have closer diplomatic communication than they ever have before. And so there have been many that have commented that this is sort of the reversal of the Sino-Soviet split. So the fact that the Chinese aren't communicating with us in this respect, I think is particularly telling. And especially now in the last couple of weeks, there has been numerous reports about air defense identification zone intrusions, which those usually don't mean anything, but also then you have civilian ships or that are listed as civilian ships and closer to Taiwanese territorial waters that are from the mainland. And of course, that's very similar to what we've talked about before: freedom of navigation, utilizing civilian craft as a means and ways to see how quick nations respond, see how quick they're how well are things looking. And so if they're not communicating with us, I think it's a pretty sure sign that tensions between the two states are higher than ever. But I think we can go through just really quickly and highlight some of the big issues that were listed out in this executive summary. So let's go with just defense policy, military strategy. PRC leaders stress the imperative of strengthening the People's Liberation Army into a world-class military by the end of 2049 as an essential element of its strategy to rejuvenate the PRC into a great modern socialist country. October 2022, Xi secured his third term as as General Secretary of the CCP, the Party Congress, and his appointment of loyalists at top positions probably will enable Xi to expand upon military modernization and goals during his next 5-year term. He's been around. Yeah, this is his third term. He really seized power in 2014. And I remember this because he had sort of a planned report for what he wants to do with the country. And there was a copy of it translated into English that you could buy at Barnes & Noble. And it was this really thick text, but I thought it was important to have. And not much of what is being listed in this report has actually changed too much from it, other than probably some timelines. Alongside that, Multi-domain precision warfare is intended to leverage a C4ISR network that incorporates advances in big data, artificial intelligence to rapidly identify key vulnerabilities and U.S. operational systems, and then combine joint forces across domains to launch precision strikes against those vulnerabilities. This is stuff that has been discussed by the Atlantic Council. There's a great report on this called like Madcom World Gone Mad, and it was originally published in 2017. It builds off an earlier article of a similar name, 2011, that discusses the use of machine learning, large language models, cybersecurity, and propaganda as a way to instill the use of artificial intelligence with respects to the news, how to get people interested in war, and to facilitate sentiments against actual facts on the ground. And we're living in that kind of conflict, I think, right now with what's been going on in both Russia, Ukraine, and now Israel. But yeah, that COVID-19 mitigations probably did not, I don't know, but at the same time, I think a lot of the COVID-19 mitigation measures from the Chinese probably did a lot of good with respects to our ongoing trade conflict with the Chinese. But feel free to chip in or say anything and interrupt me. This is a pretty open flow discussion.
Well, one of the things I noted on page 3 in chapter 1 is, it defines some basic timelines. So 2049 is sort of the timeline where China is set to be a peer to the United States. And that includes the resolution of the Taiwan question by 2049 and also the Hong Kong question by 2049. So it's interesting to have those dates as markers for, when they hope to accomplish these things. Another thing I actually have on page 5, there's this paragraph about the CCP leaders. And, basically, China seems to, according to this report, the Chinese leadership still regards itself as a socialist country, socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they say in this report many times. But they don't view themselves as having abandoned the Marxist-Leninism, but they have strategized in a different way than Mao and sort of recognize, sort of like the Soviets did with Stalin. They recognize the problems with Mao's methodology, and they lay out some cardinal principles here as well. So, yeah, they regard themselves as a Marxist-Leninist state, and that's important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and I mean, they're still holding on to the 4 cardinal principles from Deng Xiaoping that has really modernized the Chinese state from those Maoist characteristics and has led it to be more opened up, as we say, liberalization, which it never really liberalized because you still have state-owned enterprises, you still have government functionaries with all companies. And one of the things I think we've definitely noticed over the 2 terms and now that under Xi Jinping has just been the clampdown on any sort of potential rival. We've seen this a lot with billionaires either being arrested or executed. Any potential wealth that could garner political capital or even like a defection, it's been quick to shut down.
More interesting stuff, I think, is on page 7. The first line mentions a phrase we see a couple times. It says the PRC's, the People Republic of China's leaders have eagerly embraced narratives of the West's relative decline and the inevitability of China's rise as largely consistent with their strategy and evidence of China's progress. I mean, obviously this report can't admit that the U.S. is in decline, but they refer several times to the perception that we're in decline or the narrative that the West is in decline that's being embraced as some sort of I guess propagandistic tool, although like from an objective point of view it's pretty obvious that there's serious American decline happening right now. I guess unless you take some sort of turbo America thesis, so it depends on your point of view. And then right below that it also says that the party views core aspects of the current international system as incompatible with its vision for a revised order premised on its community of common destiny, which definitely sounds a lot like the co-prosperity sphere. The PRC's leaders view U.S. security alliances and partnerships, especially those in the Indo-Pacific, as destabilizing and irreconcilable with the PRC's sovereignty, security, and development issues. Well, like, duh. You know, it's just bizarre that this even needs to be. I guess it's phrased in a way like they're wrong about that. Like, the implication is that it's not actually destabilizing. It's totally fine for the U.S. to have quote unquote security, aka war guarantees, with the countries literally neighboring it. Like, obviously, the Chinese would, you know, if China had like a war guarantee with Mexico or something, or any South American country, you know, obviously anyone would view that as destabilizing. It almost doesn't need to even be said, but you know, it's a very comprehensive report. Anyone want to jump in before I say more things?
Mandrill, if you have anything, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say that's an interesting way of discussing necessary issues, basically, of like, hey, we've kind of messed up here, at least from an American point of view. But the other thing I notice is this is an official report to Congress, and I noticed there were several like typos in it. I counted at least 4 when I was reading it today, and like I haven't even like finished the full report, but I just noticed like, okay, this is supposed to be an official report to Congress. This is going to be logged in official records. Who was responsible for editing this? You know. Anyway, just a thought.
Let's see
Well,
if
these
there-
reports are written by multiple people.
I know.
I think that's important to sort of consider, because on one, there'll be sections here where it talks about, you know, the Chinese have a private sector, and then it'll also acknowledge that there are state-owned enterprises throughout within the Chinese state, which I always find particularly interesting when it comes to these things. But the other takeaway that for me that I've been noticing, because we talk about this a lot, sort of when we talk about like online right-wing politics, has been the discussion for third worldism, and how do you sort of garner that against, say, the United States, or what we would call like the global north from progressive academics. And as I've talked about with Chinese investment in Central and South America, there was this the I'm seeing this sort of be the narrative that we're going for here. For instance, in this is much later in the report, but I kind of find it important to bring up here is that the College of Defense Studies at the People's Liberation Army National Defense University, PLA-NDU, provides the highest level of training for foreign officers offered by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In addition to training foreign senior military officials, the PLA-NDU conducts international exchanges and academic discussions on defense and security issues. PLA-NDU has accepted students from more than 100 partner nations and has pursued relations with Latin American and African militaries. And I've been more focused on Latin and Central American in this report, because the emphasis on Latin America's resources, I think, is going to play a very large role in the 21st century, because we've seen a much more stratified world. This is where you get to see the talks of quote unquote deglobalization happen, where, oh, well, deglobalization doesn't mean we're all going to become Little England again. It just means that some parts of the world are going to be closed off to the West and other parts won't be. So, for instance, a lot of our lithium and some of our rare earth mineral resources, a lot of that heavily comes from Australia. Now, China doesn't get a lot of access, if no access to that at all, the last time I was checking on this stuff. So where would you go to evade Western sanctions or Five Eyes investigation on a Anglosphere country? Well, you would go to Central America, and you would go to the Lithium Triangle, which constitutes Chile, Argentina, and one third country, Chile, which that's the third nation. And I've just noticed that there has been significant growth in, despite COVID-19 restrictions during 2020, 2021, and some parts of 2022 in the world, there's been a lot more focus on minister level meetings with Latin American and Caribbean nations. So we're beginning to see whether or not Secretary of State John Kerry's words back in like 2015 still mean anything, where he said that the Monroe Doctrine is essentially dead. But those are just some of my thoughts. But go ahead, Charlemagne. You have more notes than I do. Mine are all scattered.
Well, continuing on that page, it says Beijing has also expressed concerns over growing global instability and a mounting sense of insecurity that it views as instigated by the United States. The PRC's 2019 Defense White Paper criticized the United States as the principal instigator of global instability and the driver of international strategic competition. Given the enduring suspicion among some in Beijing that the United States seeks to contain China, comma, blah, blah, blah. I mean, these are just interesting ways of phrasing these things. I mean, is the United States not trying to contain China? Why is it a suspicion? I mean, I wouldn't expect this paper to just admit that the U.S. is in fact the principal instigator of global instability and try to contain China, but also it seems like a pattern I kind of see in the U.S. is like our diplomats aren't actually willing to acknowledge we're doing what we're doing in any way, which makes diplomacy almost impossible when at no level of the government is anyone actually going to be honest about their strategic intent. Um, let's see. Page 13, Beijing aims to internationally isolate Washington and persuade countries that the United States is the sole party responsible for escalating US China tensions, primarily to deflect criticism of the PRC's efforts to reshape the international environment to protect its interests. I don't know. Again, weird way of saying that. Like, who is behind the tension here? Again, we're more or less claiming Taiwan. The U.S. is claiming Taiwan as its own, but we're gonna say
No.
like that's China's. It's not actually the U.S. that's causing the tension. Like we have aircraft carrier strike groups that just sail around provocatively. I don't know. It's just bizarre.
No. Okay. So the main right. This is clarified later when they get into the discussion on Taiwan in depth. But the entire point of sending a carrier strike group through the Strait of Taiwan is what's called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs. And essentially,
the Obama administration loved this. Like that was really
yeah.
kicked off in the pivot to Asia policy in 2011.
Absolutely. They love doing this. They do it, and we do it for not just for the Taiwanese Strait. You do it in other places too. Like when you want to play fuck games with Iran, you go through the Strait of Hormuz and do freedom of navigation operations there because Iran likes to claim more nautical miles than maybe it's entitled to in accordance with UN clause. But so the entire point, and this is where the tension comes from, is this residual claim by China, not just over Taiwan, but over what's called the 9-dash line. And of course, this report loves to talk about it a lot as well. So the entire point of the tension is China sees America as a geopolitical rival. America sees China as a rival as well. And China has a policy of one China, which basically the United States is trying to play, I guess, both agreeing to it verbally and then like back not agreeing to it practically. And so this is called what it's also called the cow's tongue right here. And essentially the main point of this whole thing is that China thinks that it's entitled to this entire region of sea, basically. And they have a long history that goes back to Zhang He and their navy, like in the 1500s or something. But basically, they have a bunch of these little tiny islands and reefs and atolls in the South China Sea, like notably the Spratly Islands, Fiery Cross, etc., etc. And basically what they do is they go in, they find an atoll, they dump a couple thousand tons of sand on it, pave it, put a barracks, an airfield, and a dock on it, and claim that this is now sovereign Chinese territory, and claim, because this is now sovereign Chinese territory, I'm going to claim the 300 nautical miles or 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone out from my shoreline. And this is basically what you're seeing here, which is it's a very maximalist claim. And so this recently, I think in 2016, was struck down in court, and basically, so the Chinese lost in court. The Philippines took the Chinese to court because there's been a whole bunch of like very dramatic scenes with China and their maritime militia messing with the Philippine fishing fleet and the Philippine Navy. And essentially, you've got the Chinese essentially now saying, stop quoting laws to us, we have swords. And that's basically the situation circa 2023. And that's essentially what the report is saying that the Chinese are doing in Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Yeah, the other thing I noticed here, of course, was that the CCP is increasingly frustrated by Washington's perceived use of an exaggerated threat picture of China to cultivate an international coalition willing to subvert the PRC's foreign policy objectives. In response, PRC leaders and officials have increasingly sought to bolster PRC relations with developing countries and Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, co-opt regional multilateral organizations such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and assert itself as the self-appointed de facto leader of the, quote, global South. Like, they are doing this. It's the wording of this that always finds it strange to me. I know Charlemagne was just talking about it. Like, they're increasingly frustrated by Washington's perceived use of an exaggerated threat picture of China. To some extent, I can see why, or why it would be an exaggerated threat picture. I mean, with a big talking point that has been held by Congress has been, of course, there's a huge difference in timelines. Like, this report's talking 2049 and the Chinese are talking 2049, whereas we're talking about the Davidson window of former, Pacific Fleet Comm Admiral Philip Davidson saying, it's 2027 or bust if we're going to do anything to defend Taiwan. Otherwise, anything after that, it's easily theirs. So we seem to have a much more short-term threat picture. The American government does. At least some camps of the U.S. State Department certainly do, as well as with the Department of Defense. But are we not, containing them? Like, is that not our policy? Like, I know Thomas says that, like, we're very good at fighting the Cold War over and over. But I mean, what is our Asiatic policy other than trying to instill some kind of containment with limited windows for economic cooperation and trade liberalization and technology imports for manufacturers? And other than that, like, we're going to be defending our existing trade routes and supply chains.
That's the other interesting thing, speaking of trade and technology, that this report also admits that China is essentially stealing technology. Basically, they're using technology transfer to steal our stuff and to steal our tech base. There was one example that stood out to me, which is that they are making a new helicopter, which is very, very similar in appearance to the SH-60 series. So, like, we don't use the SH-60 anymore, but we do use a derivative, still Sikorsky, called the MH-60. We use the MH-60 Romeo and MH-60 Sierra, respectively. So, and of course, why is that important? Well, because the best weapon to use against a submarine is an aircraft of some kind, and a helicopter is even better because you can store it on a frigate or a GDG so long as it has a hangar or and like a landing pad on it, right? Or a flight deck, I should say. So. Yeah, they're doing all of this stuff to us in return, and they're like, well, bro, like, we're going to take Taiwan, basically, and we're going to do it when we're ready in 2049, when we feel that we're ready. And the United States is like, no, you can't do that. So, anyway.
Well, I guess the problem this report really outlines is that the U.S. doesn't really know how to respond to the fact that China is saying, stop quoting laws at us, we have swords, as you said earlier. The report just seems to say China's asserting itself physically, and we don't actually have a means to stop them from doing that without causing a full-scale war, which is not what the U.S. wants to do. So they have like no strategy that will actually counter China, as far as I could tell, outlined in this report, because it's completely at odds with how the United States wants to operate with China.
Absolutely, and it's very clear that with China's strategy, especially their naval strategy of making their fleet and designing it as a fleet which is supposed to be, and of course this is, they're very good at keeping their missile systems like their long range shore based battery missile systems are very good at supporting their fleet. Because they're just exceptionally long range, right? They have a bunch of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles that they can use. And they've focused on historically over the past like 15, 20 years on basically just saying, look, we're going to project power only in our regional area, right? We're not going to project power internationally. And this report basically says, well, now that's actually changing, right? The China's strategy of basically just focusing regionally and downplaying any sort of perception of strength and making it seem like, okay, we're not as aggressive as other people might want us to look, it was an effective strategy. But now they have not just the aircraft carrier that the Russians sold them. Now they have two homebrew, home designed and built and produced aircraft carriers in service. So now they have 3 carriers, right? So we have, 11, 12 carriers, and theirs are, they have 3. One of them is an old Soviet version. But I would argue that the old Soviet carrier doesn't really matter all that much, because the true purpose of that carrier is so that they can figure out how carriers actually work. How do you use them? I need the ability to train officers and enlisted men on how a carrier operates, so that when you do build your own homebrew version, that you can design it according to your own specifications, taking those lessons in mind.
Something you said about their naval strategy as well reminds me of something I saw much later in the report on their philosophy of war, I guess you can say. There's this section on the dialectical unity of restraining war and winning war. This tenet seeks to resolve the dilemma that using too little force may project war instead of stopping it, while the unconstrained use of force may worsen a war and make it harder to stop. Calling for the effective restraint of warfare, this tenet seeks to avoid war first through sufficient military preparations and powerful conventional and strategic forces that act in concert with political and diplomatic efforts to subdue the enemy's troops without fighting.
Yeah, and you can see this strategy in their whole angle on Taiwan. Essentially, the Chinese are just saying, look, it doesn't matter how good you are tactically or on the operational level, in developing your tactical doctrine and your admirals and your ship design, if that's totally at odds with your strategic purposes. It doesn't matter, because if you have a strategic loss, you can put all of the pressure onto your local warfare commanders and onto the average soldier and sailor and marine and airman, and they can do good things for you. But if your plan is a bad strategy on the national level, it's just not going to work. And if those two things are at odds, you're going to see something happen which is disastrous.
Yeah, the Chinese strategy as well. There's a section here, taking the operational initiative. This aspect emphasizes the effective use of offensives at the operational and tactical level, avoiding enemy strengths and concentrating on building asymmetric advantages against enemy weaknesses to change what is inferior into what is superior. That type of line reminds me a lot of that Unrestricted Warfare book I read by the 2 Chinese colonels. It's a very Chinese way of thinking. It's not really something you would see in the U.S. Like the U.S. fights every war like it's World War II, where you just apply overwhelming force, which is how we're trying to deal with Taiwan militarily from like a posturing stance, not physically, at least not yet. But this concept of, okay, we're just going to avoid whatever your strengths are, build asymmetries, and then focus everything in a highly integrated way on this one thing, both from the cyber domain, political, diplomatic, militarily operational. Everything's going to focus on this one weak point. We'll snap it, and then you'll lose basically instantly. Not because we applied overwhelming force, but because we more like judoed you or whatever.
Yeah, and this is where you also get. I liked the line above this, right, where it's combining strategic defense with operational and tactical offense. That's, if you wanted to put the Chinese strategy in the South China Sea in a nutshell, that's exactly what they're doing, right? You're taking your strategic goal, which is I want to control this zone, this area right next to my country, but I'm willing to use my military forces in an aggressive manner. That's exactly what they're doing, and they're willing to use a spectrum of force, not just like the way that we think of force, where we're going from, okay, we're not at war, which is a zero force used, to, okay, now we're at war and we're willing to use everything up to and including, possibly nuclear weapons, which is absolute usage of deadly force and probably civilian collateral damage, etc. Their idea of a force continuum is much more of a spectrum. They're much more willing to use things lower on the scale. They're much better at using economy of force in if you wanted to use the nine principle of war term for that purpose.
I would say that the Chinese way of thinking clearly is more equipped to handle the complexities of the 21st century in terms of power politics and warfare than the United States view seems to be.
A lot of what I'm reading here is, especially this, soldiers and the people are the source of victory. This integrates the concept of active defense with the concept of people's war. People's wars comprises subordinate military strategies, guerrilla war, and protracted war that Mao saw as a means to harness the capacity for China's populace as a source of political legitimacy and mobilization to generate military power. Contemporary PRC writings link people's war to national mobilization and participation in wartime as a whole of nation concept warfare. This isn't anything I haven't read already from Mearsheimer back in '93 about it's people and armies that win war. If you have political legitimacy and the nation is motivated to fight for you, and you actually have the boots on the ground that can win it and hold territory, that's how you do it. You know, we kind of talk about it in politics, where it's just like when we see like the Proud Boys or whatever saying whose streets are streets, and then they go like stay in a hotel or they take a bus home. Those aren't your streets, those aren't your streets when you send a couple Tomahawk missiles. Like, are guys still going to come back the next day and hold that territory? Then it's essentially their territory. And this is what I'm seeing here is like the people have to be involved in it, mass mobilization, and they have a command and centralized state economy that they can do this. If America wanted to go World War II, like, total war style deal, it would take I think a pretty significant turnaround for us to do it. Not to mention, how do you get a multi-ethnic democracy on board to do so? Whereas here, you pretty much have a majority population. It's pretty mono-ethnic. You've kind of cleared out a lot of your ethnic squabbles, either by putting them in camps or suppressing them and re-educating them. So they have the capacity to do this, whereas I don't think we do. And these are the things that a lot of realists were writing about 20 and 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is way later in the report, but this reminds me of when the report is actually talking about their usage of roll-on, roll-off ships for a potential usage in Taiwan invasion. This is on page one. I think it's 160 if you want to type it in. But anyway, so there's a line that I looked at in that section, which is they're totally flabbergasted on why the Chinese would do this. and it's not difficult to understand why. You know, they even note, well, if the Chinese do this, they actually have, in terms of tonnage, greater capacity than, you know, the U.S. Navy's amphibious, you know, warfare capacity. If they have, because basically what they're doing is they're taking these civilian ships, these are like car carrier ships, designing them so that they can like have amphibious capacity, right? They can deploy amphibious armored vehicles from them in an invasion, and it basically, these are ships that are used, and this is where you start getting into difficult territory, because it seems that the United States does not understand that China really knows better than we do, almost, that if you're mobilizing for war, you're mobilizing the entire populace, and that includes economic assets as well, right? So you're building these merchant vessels which have this capability. You're potentially arming them with missiles, with a anti-ship cruise missile in a shipping container, concealed in a shipping container, I should say. And they're complaining. This report is really confused about how, well, but you're blurring the line between military and civilian. And I just thought to myself, what line between military and civilian? World War II, the entire 20th century, is a total disillusionment of the fact that, you know, when you set two populations at war with other populations, there is no distinction effectively. And so this is a very clever way of getting a capability, militarily and in naval terms, to do something that is probably much cheaper than the way the U.S. Navy would do it. And also the usage of civilian vessels, which can be converted to and from military usage, is not anything new. Like the Dutch, in their wars against England in the 1650s, had a similar navy where they had a large merchant vessel fleet where they converted it all to warships, and then when peace came, they converted it all back. And of course, that had problems for them, in terms of, you know, a purpose-built, designed military asset's going to be better than a civilian asset which has dual use. But for their purposes and for what they're trying to do, which is to project power in their local region, in their backyard, this is exactly what works for them.
Yeah, this is sort of the theme of the entire report, that the Chinese don't have this hard distinction between the military and their civilian population. Basically, it's all integrated together, and there's a number of things in here about dual use technologies, as you mentioned, but really their entire society is oriented towards their strategic aims, and the management of the civilians is done with a mind to their military aims, you know, in whatever ways is suitable. The civilians are a military resource, and all of their economic activity is managed with thought to their future military preparations. The U.S. doesn't think like that, and actually, this touches on something way earlier in the report. On page 32, there's this military personnel talent cultivation system. It says this aspect of MCF also seeks to reform the PRC's talent cultivation system, which encompasses hundreds of talent recruitment plans in order to improve China's human capital, build a highly skilled workforce, and recruit foreign experts to provide access to know-how, expertise in foreign technology. I mean, the idea of a this idea of human capital and improving the quality of your human capital is laughable in the United States. If anything, you know, we have words for this like bio-Leninism, but we have a human talent destruction system, whereas the Chinese have a cultivation system. Their civilians are viewed as just another asset in the continuum of warfare. You know, whether or not you want to say that's morally right or wrong, like whatever, that doesn't really have anything to do with the reality of war. And the U.S. just does not. The the U.S. This report just doesn't seem to actually comprehend why they're doing this. They sort of view it as this weird totalitarian oddity about their system, and not it doesn't seem to grasp the implications of all of this.
Yeah, and frankly, this also reminds me of their militia, right? Because you have the People's Liberation Army, right? You have their naval area, which is the PLAN, the plan, as I like to call it, trust the plan. But you've also got the PLA Air Force. You've also got the Rocket Forces, which is just a hilarious name. That's almost like the Space Force. But you've also got the militia, right? Which is like almost it's a feeder mechanism for people into the military from one aspect, but it's also a military unit in and of itself. Which imagine the United States having a we kind of do this with the reserves, with the individual ready reserve, but not really. Like those people are still subject under military obligation and can be called up whenever the president says so. And President Biden literally did this year. He called up members of both the active reserves as well as the drilling reserves, as well as the individual ready reserve, which most people think that the individual ready reserve is kind of a joke. It won't happen unless a world war happens. But the Chinese have this weird system where they have a militia as well. And if people basically flunk out of basic, army training, regular army training, because they have a conscription system, of course, they go to the militia and they do remedial training with the militia to get good. So that's like, it's just, and also they do like humanitarian missions and things, and they're a military unit in and of themselves that can be utilized. And it can also be used, obviously, for people who are, above the military age men of 18 to 35. So you have this this weird, like, multiple tiered system of manpower, like, built into the system, right? So you have like, okay, I need top tier talent to go to this place or to this place in the military, because the highest tier talent needs to go into things like electronic warfare, things like missiles and fire control systems, etc., and fighter pilots, etc. But if you have like your average Chinese peasant in the provinces somewhere, well, what do you give them? A basic training and probably a old Soviet steel helmet and a beat up AK-47, and as we saw in Ukraine, and this is what the Chinese also think. How do you take an asset which is of low quality and turn it into something useful? And the Chinese seem to have a greater nose for this than we do, because our version of taking something that's low quality or old or degraded in terms of its maintenance capacity, not just in personnel, is to take this asset and then just throw it out and get it blown up in Ukraine, and for very little geostrategic or geopolitical gain. Whereas the Chinese are basically saying, look, we know this is a low quality asset. We know that this isn't going to do much, but if we can use this militia to fight in the mountains, if we can use it in, like the Ukrainians are using it in Bakhmut or now in Artemovsk, it looks like, you can take very low quality troops and actually stonewall your opponent for a little bit, and so you get capability out of something else.
This is, I think, a big aspect that we're kind of overlooking, and this report doesn't talk about it. Maybe because it is a report to the appropriating body of our government, i.e., appropriations in the budget. But I'm going to refer to some research from our friend Mr. Sandbatch real quick. I'm going to share this tab instead, because Mike Johnson's district, the Speaker of the House, is Louisiana District 4, and that place is more or less just where a lot of our military money and grant money goes towards, because you've got the fort there. But I'm going to share this tab instead. So he says, Looking through LA4 and some of the grants that get flowed through the area, we already got some fun stuff in this data set. Remember, we're looking for stuff like cyber research, cooperative grants, GWACs, etc. All the fun little things that the government spends money on, but you never think about. This is Mike Johnson's district. On March 3rd, 2019, the Department of the Army, for instance, shelled grants to the tune of $13 million a year and another $600,000 towards these guys, the Research Triangle Institute in Durham, North Carolina. Groovy, but how does this help us sell cheeseburgers? And it's showing off, what they do: independent nonprofit research, human condition, artificial intelligence, global health security, police research, drone application, biological stuff. Oh, and it's these guys, a division and affiliate in Bossier Community College. Wait a minute. And then here's the director, high-powered guy at a community college, director of the staff, Joint Global Strike Ops Center, director of the staff, Air Force Global Strike Command, and now director of the Cyber Innovation Center in Bossier City, Louisiana, partnership intermediary agreement. And the kind of stuff that they do: Strike Work selects 26 entities to pitch their solution to countering small drones. This is 3 days ago, for those of you wondering about the currency of the Air Force, wondering how to counter swarms of drones. And that's got its own tab that we can look into. And we may have some fun in the data set this weekend. Anyone still unclear on how Mike Johnson got a speaker's chair? I think it's kind of interesting to sort of highlight something that I didn't notice in this report. I mean, it's all about China, but they talk about how the Chinese are spending their money. They talk about how where the PLA is getting appropriations, where are they seeing a spending increase in funding, what's their GDP to military budget ratio, and so on. But I think it is a clear difference that we have to keep in mind, is just how do we shell out our money? Where do we shell out our sort of where do we want to get research done? And we do still have like these sort of semi-public private partnerships where a lot of ex-feds go out into community colleges and set up these groups that get DARPA money and so on. But it is different to see that we don't do that. Our economy is not structured to where at any point in time, if we are pinpricked, the whole nation can be motivated to return in force and kind to strike back. Whereas this is all about human capital improvement within the country itself. They're not immigration dependent. We're heavily immigration dependent, and you get people like Peter Zeihan who say, well, like the way that you counter China is that we can just import the world's best talent. But as we've seen already with numerous spy rings that have been busted and numerous investigations into places like Stanford University, that comes with severe operational security risks of defection, spying, sabotage, etc.
And it's funny because they do mention that in this report as well. So
yeah, they do mention that actually.
Yeah.
But the Chinese are stealing our technology, which counters that entire strategy you just laid out, and this one weird trick to defeat your opponent. One other thing, and this is really interesting. I find the Chinese way of war very interesting on page 40. And I don't just mean the bold letters in that sentence, but the concepts they employ. But it says the PLA increasingly views warfare as a confrontation between opposing operational systems rather than a war of annihilation between opposing mechanized military forces. Following this logic, PLA writings refer to systems destruction warfare as the next way of war, transforming from mechanized warfare to an informatized and intelligentized style warfare. Although not a new PLA approach, systems destruction warfare likely continues to be the principal theory guiding its way of war. And this is just fascinating because this is completely at odds with the Western way of war or American way of war that it lays out in here, which is a war of annihilation. This is basically how the war in Ukraine is being fought right now on both sides. And the Chinese don't view war like this at all. They view it as this again. The war isn't just the battlefield. The war is everything, and the war is opposing systems, and you win by breaking down your opponent's system to create, as I said earlier, an asymmetry that you can exploit to gain some advantage there and defeat the opponent without actually engaging their strongest forces. Where
Right,
the way we
and-
fight is just go find the enemy's You defeat the enemy in the field of battle, their strongest army. You defeat that with yours. If you're more powerful, you win. That's how you fight a war. But the Chinese have a totally different philosophy of warfare. I do not think that. I mean, this should the whole report should really talk about this concept. How important this concept of systems destruction warfare is.
Yeah, and this is a you can tell that the Western way of war is completely opposed to this, and you summed it up very well. And many other thinkers have, like Victor Davis Hanson and others have mentioned this, that the West basically has, in terms of military philosophy, it's very much, as you mentioned, total in its view. It says, I win when I kill you. Basically, I win when I kill your people and break your stuff. And I really don't care how much you have humiliated me diplomatically or whether you've occupied my country. Well, you still didn't defeat me on the battlefield, so whatever. I just don't care for humiliation. I only care for victory. And the Chinese is much more Eastern. You can tell because they integrate both together, and they like to synthesize it. I mean, one of the biggest problems with asymmetric conflict and with the whole war on terror in the Middle East is that the Eastern way of war is much more different, and I think that this really comes down to Western history. I think it has to come down to, we basically, as a people, view ourselves as fighting in a pike block, right? This is how we like to fight. We like to fight in a square, with pointy sticks, and fighting as a mass of manpower. Your job as a soldier is not to do amazing, awesome, cool stuff. Your job is to do your job, stay in rank no matter what, and just fill in the ranks when the next guy next to you gets blown away. Whereas in contradistinction to this, you have the way of the warrior, who is much more individualistic, who is much less willing to cooperate, who is much more talented or much less talented as on the individual level, who seeks personal glory rather than victory on the field. And in defeating, or the entire definition of defeat is different for those two systems. The way of the warrior is humiliating and ritually defeating your enemy almost, not necessarily killing him. And so the Chinese are essentially synthesizing the Western way of war by saying, yes, we will have all of this military stuff. We will have all of these amazing technological advancements, and we will be able to use mass, the rolling mass of manpower that is available to us. But we also can use other mechanisms and other ways of victory that don't involve force when it's not directly in our interests to actually use force. From a Westerner's perspective, and I like to bash on our current regime for this, is you're not willing to go to war with these people. You need to not do proxy war, basically. Shit or get off the pot. Either you're directly willing to intervene in this conflict, or you're not willing to do anything at all, basically.
Isn't our policy though on this issue, Mandrill, is more or less to achieve some form of standoff? I mean, isn't this not what at least U.S. Army doctrine has been written about? Like, I remember this was during the Trump administrations, but you had U.S. Army Multi-Domain Operations Plan 2028. This is Trad Doc Pamphlet 52531. And it was more or less discussing, and I'll get the quote exactly here, and because I pulled up the document. So this is again under Mark Milley. I'm going to share this tab instead. One of the duties of Army professionals is to think deeply and clearly of the problem of armed conflict in the future so we can build and prepare our Army to deter that conflict and, if necessary, fight and win it. As we consider the Army's future, our Army's challenge is clear. In the new era of great power competition, our nation's adversaries seek to achieve their strategic aim short of conflict by the use of layered standoff, all multi-domains, land, sea, air, cyberspace, in order to function and defeat us. Like, we're dealing on how do we solve the problem of layered standoff. I think this is pretty. I think like at least the USG in 2018 had an understanding from what the Chinese are saying here, which is about systems of warfare and how do you find ways to see weaknesses and use those to your advantage. Like, so if we have a weak cybersecurity department, that means that they can, keep us at a standoff. They can't allow us to engage and still buy us time because we're operating on a shorter time window. They're operating on a longer one. To me, I'm sort of looking at it. I think that the U.S. government's kind of aware. I think this report is written in such a way that this is meant for congressmen to easily digest shit more than it is for people inside the State Department or the Joint Chiefs of Staff that would respond in kind. This just to me is like baby's first understanding of how the PLA works. But I could be wrong. I feel like there is some semblance that the USG is aware that there is systems warfare and that things are multi-domain. That's why Trump pushed for a space force, although every president pushes for some kind of security apparatus that's his baby.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I mean, the report repeats itself over and over again to the point where it kind of becomes infuriating, and then there's executive summaries all over the place. I mean, so it's designed for stupid people. I mean, this itself is some commentary that the report has to be made for like people with 90 IQ in order to be presented to Congress. So obviously that's a problem because the Chinese don't have this problem, right?
Yeah, they don't. They have the central committee, and it's these people. And I'm not a Sinophile by any stretch of the imagination. I do think of them as a civilizational rival, but I mean, I see what the U.S. Army Multi-Domains Operation 2028 is a concept. One, to continue to refine the warfighting concept. Two, to develop a comprehensive Army modernization strategy linked to this concept and synchronized with a joint approach to force development. Three, drive rapid, nonlinear solutions in Army doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, etc. Four, deepen the operational integration of the general purpose of special forces operations and our allies. And that last one is interesting to me because this has been stuff that even our more mainstream academics, like in that George Friedman book from like 2009, The Next 100 Years, he says that like the future of warfare is smaller forces and with a heavier emphasis on special operations. And I think that is a very American way of thinking, in part because one, we're a volunteer military. Two, we really haven't gone all out, outside of maybe, I mean, we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I mean, like, we haven't gone all out in any sort of way similar to Vietnam until those time frames. And we're kind of trying to way to maybe not do so large scale. How can we do things on a smaller scale and get bigger results? Whereas warfare right now seems to be very much multi-dimensional. It's still got, we're integrating drones in ways against armor that I don't think we would have thought about maybe 20 years ago. And so I see that both sides here are looking at it in a systems format. How, or as a Lul would call it, how do you have the best technique? May the best technique win against your enemy.
Yeah, the problem the U.S. has is it's the U.S. can't actually mobilize itself like the Chinese can, even during quote unquote peacetime. If the population is entirely demoralized, for China this doesn't matter. But in a quote unquote democratic system, the people actually have to be even if they're propagandized to it, they have to view themselves as freely choosing to fight for something, to fight for their country, to be patriotic, this sort of thing. So I think the U.S. might be focusing on these smaller domain things like the special forces because they have far fewer human material to work with, not because of a population problem or something, but because they've demoralized their own human capital to the point where it can't be utilized any further. So there's sort of this weird. This actually gets into some discussions we've had previously, not necessarily on stream, but on Twitter, or even privately. There's a sort of gap between the military and the civilian government, where the civilian government is literally destroying the human capital that the military needs in order to complete its mission, through the endless demoralization of Americans. So this is a really serious problem for the military and it's one the military can't fix. It's one that they have to make the civilian government fix.
I want to take a moment and go to the because we got on special forces. It's on page 85.
Of the document, or when you open up the PDF, 85 of 212, or
85 of the document. So it's 103 of 212.
Thank you, sir. There you go.
I just want to note these insanely hilarious unit names for their special forces battle groups. Just look at these ridiculous names.
It probably sounds better in Chinese.
Probably. I'm like Sea Dragon, Sword of the South, the Thunder Gods, Sacred Sword of the East.
Let us never let casual knee-jerk racism underestimate what these people could do. But yes, some of these names are funny.
My favorite is just sharks.
Sharks. Baby sharks.
Ferocious tigers of the Central Plain. Sharp Blade. I like just Sharp Blade. You know.
Snow leopards of the plateau.
These go pretty hard. I'm not gonna lie. Some of these
Tigers
go pretty
of the
hard.
Northeast. Yeah, I mean these are some of these are pretty badass, but it's just
Mountain Eagle Commando Unit. Yeah, that sounds pretty cool to me.
So this is interesting though, because the Special Operations Forces section does point out that China's special forces lacks real-world combat experience. This is something that the U.S. has an asymmetrical advantage in, at least over China, is that our special operations is far superior to the Chinese, because we deploy them all over the planet to kill people, and the Chinese don't do that.
That's pointed out in the I think it's the executive review or executive summary. All of Chinese special forces units lack real-world combat experience. China SOF does not have a national-level special operations command to oversee all of China's special forces operations capabilities. Despite an emphasis on conducting joint training, theater commanders have no authority over PAP units, making them difficult to incorporate the People's Army.
That's the
Army.
People's Army Police.
The People's Army Police Special Forces into PLA training exercises.
Yeah, that's like their version of internal special police, right? It's almost like the FBI, or what we would classify for border patrol agents or something.
Check.
Yeah, it's a paramilitary.
The big thing that as I've pointed out and others have pointed out is that America does have an asymmetrical advantage when it comes to not only its special forces, but also counterinsurgency or just limited deployments. I mean, we're constantly all over the world at all times. Like, for better or for worse, whatever your take on that is, even for my international listeners, like the USG has the capability of massive force projection that the PLA just doesn't have. And that the last peer-to-peer style conflict that they were really engaged in outside of some counterinsurgency, counter-terror operations inside of their own country has been with Vietnam in 1979. And that was sort of a bloody nose for them, to put it gently. So I think that's sort of important to consider. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the nuclear triad. Because that kind of plays the role in all discussions of large nuclear capabilities. On page 62, which is on page 80 for the PDF, it said that the People's Liberation Army Air Force and Plan Aviation together constitute the largest aviation forces in the region and the third largest in the world, with over 3,150 total aircraft, not including trainer variants or autonomous vehicles, which approximately 2,400 of them are combat aircraft. And this includes fighters, strategic bombers, tactical bombers, multi-mission tactical and attack aircraft. The PLAAF's role is serve a comprehensive strategic air force capable of long-range firepower. And then the second thing that I wanted to bring up was up there on the top, which is right here. October 2019, the PRC signaled the return of its airborne leg of its nuclear triad after the PLAAF publicly revealed the H-6N their first nuclear-capable air-to-air refuelable bomber. We have our own issues with that. I mean, we have the B2. I know that we're bringing a newer, updated version of that. We're still heavily reliant on the B-52s. Our nuclear triad is aging. The Russians recently did a test. We also responded by testing a launch of a Minuteman III rocket platform. But the nuclear triad, according to the latest nuclear readiness report, which is I think it's called the NPR or something like that, that every new administration gets, that we're in desperate need of updating it. Some parts of it probably should stay old tech or analog for the purposes of not being hacked, but they're signaling a desire to increase their nuclear capabilities. And whether you think nukes are real or whatever, I know some people in chat do, or some have expressed their ambivalence towards them. Nuclear armed states are the ones that get the seat at the table. This is why you saw nations like South Africa, Israel, Iran, all pursue it. And if you give them up, it's a lot easier to be invaded. See Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the function of nuclear weapons after the Cold War is basically as a guarantor of sovereignty rather than as a likely military weapon. So this is important in that respect. It's in many ways the state of any given country's nuclear arsenal is sort of a technological flex they can make to the rest of the world in order to gain or lose reputation with whatever parties that activity's aimed at, like the two tests you just referenced.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does indicate that there is a move towards increasing their nuclear arsenal. I think it's discussed in this report about their...
Yeah, there's a bunch of maps about what missiles they have, what their ranges are. Effectively, they have a perfectly suitable nuclear arsenal in terms of assured destruction. So...
Yeah, it's on page 199 of the PDF, but it was just simply saying, I'll just put it up here because I just think that this stuff always interests me because I think that the West at least still kind of thinks in that Cold War mindset, especially. PRC views the development of nuclear and conventional capabilities as necessary components of its asymmetric countermeasures to approach to defeat strong enemies seeking to develop capabilities that exploit PRC's strengths and take advantage of its weaknesses. An advantage to improving nuclear and conventional capabilities, Z has urged the PLA to speed up development of other non-traditional capabilities, such as space, cyberspace domains to support modern warfare, further intelligentization of the PLA to win local wars. It's also committed to maintaining deterrence against nuclear rivals. PRC experts view a survivable second strike capability is crucial to national security. PRC understanding of nuclear deterrence has focused on maintaining a sufficient capability to inflict unacceptable destruction against potential adversaries. Chinese think tanks are concerned about the credibility of its nuclear deterrent due to its smaller nuclear force, which may not be seen by adversaries as sufficiently survivable in nuclear conflict. Yeah, you always want to have second strike capability, and that was what the Russians were testing out, was how do you survive a nuclear raid and respond in kind. So I mean, they are boosting their nuclear capabilities, whether it's with a new bomber that can carry both nuclear or hypersonic capabilities. But they're looking for ways of, well, outside of just traditional means, how do you do it via propaganda, intelligence, cyberspace, and real space?
Yeah, so I don't have anything else highlighted in the report. Oh, other than I just thought it was interesting that China at this point denies all lethal assistance to the war in Ukraine, which is interesting. Although the report does point out that Russia's benefiting from buying lots of drone parts from China, which are more or less civilian implements, and using them as a weapon. And obviously, drones are very important. Yeah, China's expansive and unregulated commercial drone market has allowed Russian defense forces to routinely acquire small drones and dual-use unmanned aerial vehicles to support their war in Ukraine. So China is, basically supporting the Russian conflict, but not providing lethal assistance. At least they claim they're not providing lethal assistance, and probably they aren't. I mean, I think they're probably happy to allow Russia to simply integrate itself into China's economy to support their war effort, and avoid any problems with providing direct lethal aid.
Yeah, the only two things that I also had highlighted on this was how it views allies, and then what I have up on screen, which is about influence campaigns. I was particularly interested to notice that TikTok was not mentioned at all in this, but instead we have the discussion over social media and influence campaigns. So, we have cyber operations. We have cognitive domain operations. CDO combines psychological warfare with cyber operations to shape adversary behavior and decision making. Which I wonder how much CDO looks over social media and TikTok. PLA probably intends to use CDO as an asymmetric capability to deter U.S. or third-party entry into future conflict, or as an offensive capability to shape perceptions and polarize society. This has been talked about in that MadCom paper I was talking about earlier. Like the Atlantic Council's written about, they call them MadComs, which is essentially just like machine-assisted communication and propaganda tools. They have a lengthy definition. MadCom doesn't stand for anything. But it would be a form of psychological asymmetric, using large language models, artificial general intelligence to have offensive capability. And this is where you get the whole info hazard discussion. Like, hey, large language model, give me the genome for pneumonia, and then I can like mess with it. So,
well, it's worth pointing out here that these psychological or cognitive weapons are amplified in effect when our own government is also engaged in psychological warfare against us. You get people always default to calling you a Chinese or Russian bot or shill or something like that because they don't comprehend the degree to which you're at odds with your own government. Basically, you could imagine America. The solution to this problem is to simply not demoralize your own population and to have a unified population that the state actually doesn't hate and supports. So there's really no answer to this cognitive warfare so long as the domestic demoralization program from the American government continues. I can't think of an answer to it.
yeah, I said that in my piece on Substack about how we perceive the war with respects to like Israel and Gaza and such. And I said, like, for Americans, like, whatever you get in the news, good luck. You're the most psyoped people on the face of the earth. You're not just being psyoped by like foreign adversaries, you're being psyoped by your own government. But yeah, I like this, the three warfares concept, which calls for the coordinated use of public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. Public opinion warfare creates and disseminates information to guide an adversary's public opinion and gain support from domestic and foreign audiences. Psychological warfare utilizes propaganda, deception, coercion to induce pressure and affect the behavior of target audiences. Legal warfare uses domestic and international laws to shape narratives that advance Chinese interests and undermine those of an adversary. PLA likely seeks to combine digital influence activities with three warfare's concept to demoralize adversaries and influence domestic and foreign audiences, thus creating an advantageous environment advantageous to the PRC. It's like, yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure we do it too, and it's sort of being like one of the major hotbed centers of propaganda. I mean, like, there was debate. Like, I saw a lot of libertarians in like 2014 pointing out, like, oh, the National Defense Authorization Act means that we can like create propaganda at home. And I'm just like, does everyone not remember what the hell all the Transformer movies were with Michael Bay? Like, stick a hot chick and show off like cool military tech under like a 1980s like children's intellectual property. We still do it. Top Gun was basically a great Navy recruiting thing. In Top Gun 2,
Battleship.
Yeah, Battleship. With who was in it? Rihanna or whatever.
Yeah, you had Rihanna.
Really?
Rihanna. You had Rihanna in Battleship. Yeah,
I forgot about that. I love
Battle
that movie.
Los Angeles. That's my go-to comfort movie with the Marines. Just like Aaron Eckhart's going to shoot aliens, and we're going to fight in Los Angeles. It's so fucking cool. But yeah, we do it all the time. I mean, America's army, right? You know, as a recruiting tool, we're not really good at it nowadays. I don't think, and that's a big problem. Is the demoralization. I don't know who's really excited to fight for the United States, and I mean, it's reflected in our recruiting numbers. Like every crisis, uh, there's every branch, with the exception of the United States Navy, is struggling to meet their goals, and the United States Navy only met their goals by like 22 people. Like it's insane.
Yeah, and well, I think the other exception was the Marine Corps, but they're not entirely paused yet.
This paragraph kind of sounds like Curtis Yarvin giving a definition of what an NGO is.
Which paragraph?
The one you just read.
Oh yeah, kind of. If I were to get DARPA money, this is what I would be doing.
What sentence are you talking about?
Just the whole paragraph.
Yeah, like 3 warfares. How do I make an environment advantageous to my NGO? Well, I would utilize public opinion, legal warfare, and deception to make sure that my enemies look like shit. Like if I were part of the American Jewish Congress right now, I would be utilizing 3 warfares to ensure that all those kids at Harvard who were doing their like pro-Palestine protests never got hired again. They we do it. So yeah, the other thing that I also wanted to sort of cover was on page, it's actually really early in the report, and it talks about Pakistan. And it was that despite encompassing rhetoric, the PRC uses nomenclature to implicitly rank its level of partnership. For example, the PRC ranks Pakistan as its only all-weather strategic partner, Russia as its only comprehensive strategic partner with coordinating relations, and other countries such as Brazil and various states in South and Southeast Asia holding all-round strategic partnership relations. There's interesting language, like all-weather strategic partner, like you're not just a fair weather friend, Pakistan. You're an all-weather friend, comprehensive strategic partner with coordinating relations, and that's why you see the relationship between China and Russia, because of the war in Ukraine, has been so interesting, because they do coordinate, they do share intelligence, they do joint exercises, and I don't know if there's been a book or a paper written about this, and I hope either in chat or in the comments section for whoever's listening can, or maybe you guys know as well. Has there been a report or a book written about our time in Afghanistan and Iraq from like the Russian or a Chinese perspective? Because if I were someone in the PRC and I was working for like PLA planning division, I would be looking at how America fought the war on terror and taking a shitload of notes. Because I mean, that's what unrestricted warfare was. It was basically an after action report for how America conducted the first Gulf War. And has one been written about that from these perspectives, do you think? Have you heard of one?
It's probably being written in progress right now.
It's a very specific topic, so it would be difficult, I would think, to find an actual book that's been translated into English on this topic. If one does exist, I'd be surprised if it was translated into English. There must be some Russian or Chinese books published on the topic, but whether or not they're sort of at the political level you'd want them to be, I'm not sure. I don't know, but that's worth looking into.
Yeah, I figured I'd ask because I know you've been reading a lot of books from the Russians, Charlemagne. I figured that maybe you might have seen something.
No, I'm thinking back to the bibliography, I guess, of I think Glazniev is the diplomat I was reading, but I don't think he wrote anything on this. And actually, not all of his books are translated either.
Well, yeah, of course. It's kind of hard to get a hold of Russian stuff right now that's been translated into English. Yeah, but the PRC's foreign policy framework includes efforts to promote and accelerate the transformation and the distribution of power, revise the principles. We're getting that language again. I love this language. Revise the principles of interstate relations. So this is clearly giving the buzzword revisionist state to policymakers. We love using the terms in international relations discourse and academia. You have revisionist and hegemonic states. Hegemonic states are the ones that are in charge. They establish the rules-based order for whatever the system is. Revisionist states wish to revise that and to either subvert or supplant the existing hegemonic power and be the one in charge. And this is why you see this report constantly document, oh, it's the Chinese that perceive us as accelerating the timeline, or that we're doing this. And it's because we view the Chinese as a revisionist state. And those are some important things to keep in mind. But those are the last two big things that I wanted to keep in mind. I'm thinking about writing a Substack to just sort of review the things that stuck out as interesting in more detail. But I'm going to just quickly get us to the super chats, unless there's any other things in this report you two want to cover.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly cover
Sure.
the PLA Navy, if you don't mind.
All right. Yeah. What page?
Let's see. In the PDF, it's page 70 is where it starts.
Alrighty. Great. Let's go.
Okay, so key takeaways. The first sentence: the PRC has numerically the largest navy in the world, with an overall battle force of over 370 ships and submarines, including more than 140 major surface combatants. Yeah. How big is the U.S. Navy again? 265, 270, 255, something like that? Yeah.
U.S. Navy personnel size is 336,978 personnel. 336,900. Yeah, active duty 101,583 in the ready reserve.
And that Navy's also spread across the entire planet.
Yeah.
Yes.
With 4,000 operational aircraft, 299 deployable combat vessels as of July 18, 2023.
Yep. Anyway, so China has, like I keep mentioning, they do this weird thing where they build two of a class, they figure out what's wrong with it, and then they build more of it if it works. So they've got this 8th Renhai class cruiser that they're building. This is their modern guided missile cruiser. The Chinese classify this as a destroyer, but the U.S. Navy classifies a cruiser as something that has the ability to carry a flag officer on it. So it's got a berthing for him and the electronic warfare capacity for an admiral to be on board. All right, so you've got Jiangkai, Luoyang 3, DDGs. They're just increasing their Navy in every single capacity. It's the same thing across the board, the entire report. It's like they're just every capacity, every technological capability, every ship, every tank, they're building more of them. So the one thing that I want to draw attention to, other than the actual numbers here, is that the biggest issue is right. You've got especially the missiles, and I want to draw attention especially to the submarines, right? Because this report also says that they're modernizing their submarine force, which was news to me. So, and there, of course, says they're placing high priority on modernizing their submarine force, but its force structure continues to grow modestly as it works to mature its force, integrate new technologies, and expand its shipyards. They operate 6 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, 6 nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs, and 48 diesel-powered AIP, that's air-independent powered attack submarines, or SSs. Right? So that's old World War II diesel technology, which is not obsolete by any means. So they're growing to 65 units by 2025 and 80 units by 2035, despite ongoing retirement of older hulls, right? Those are all probably Soviet hulls, like the Kilo class submarine. So of course they acquired 12 Kilo class subs, which are capable of launching ASCMs. That is the, if I remember correctly, the SSN-27, which is a very dangerous missile. It's one of the most dangerous ones in their inventory. It's an old Soviet missile, but it still is very good. So yeah, they've constructed 12 nuclear submarines, 2 Shang-1 class SSNs, 4 Shang-2 class SSNs, 6 Jin class SSBNs, and these are all equipped with the JL-2 submarine launched ballistic missile, the JL-3, and they have the actual ranges listed. This one has the JL3 has a range of 5,400 nautical miles. So yes, and of course you can see that they have that listed on the ballistic missile map later in this document as well, so you can actually see what that actually looks like on the world map, which is a wonderful map. If we can, we'll get to. I'll ask you to pull it up in a bit. But essentially, right, the same thing for all of their surface combatants, and this is really where the U.S. Navy is going to get, or at least for the last 10 years, was in a bit of trouble, because not only do the Chinese have ex-Soviet hardware like the Sovereign DDG, they've also built their home brew stuff, and for example, like this is on page 74 now. The plan has expanded its force of large surface combatants with 2 programs, the Luoyang 3 DDG and the Renhai CG, like we mentioned. So they've commissioned 25 Luoyang 3 DDGs, including 12 lengthened Luoyang 3 mod DDGs with additional hulls under construction. So they've modified it slightly. Both the standard Luoyang 3 and the Luoyang 3 mod have 64-cell multi-purpose vertical launch systems capable of launching cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, anti-submarine missiles, and the mod variants will be capable of carrying the new Z-20 ASW, that's anti-submarine warfare helicopter, by late 2022. 8 Renhai class CGs were in commission with additional hulls under construction. So I'm going to skip to the next paragraph because that's what is more important. They also have released test launch of an anti-ship ballistic missile with a reported range of 540 nautical miles from their Renhai CG. That's why that platform is very important, because that's an anti-ship ballistic missile, not an anti-ship cruise missile. And the plan continues to emphasize ASW, anti-surface warfare capabilities, and its force development. The plan's frigates and corvettes, as well as modernized older combatants, carry variants of the YJ-83 ASCM, while newer surface combatants, such as the Luoyang 2 class DDGs, are fitted with the YJ-62. So why is this important? So the reason why this is important is because of the ranges, right? The U.S. Navy has recently begun upgrading its harpoons with a new block variant of harpoon to give it increased range. The range listed on Wikipedia for that is something around 165 nautical miles. Problem, though, is the Naval Strike Missile, which is the missile that's going to be associated with the FFG-62, as I've mentioned in your previous stream on the FFG-62 Prude, that's not quite ready yet. So this new block of harpoon is kind of a stopgap. The range of a normal harpoon missile of previous iterations, previous blocks of harpoon, as listed on Wikipedia, is 75 nautical miles. That's not the real range. The real range is classified, but you get an idea. So the YJ-83 ASCM, this is the basic block of it, has a range of 135 nautical miles. The later variants with the YJ-62 have a range of 270 nautical miles. And it goes on to say that the Luoyang 3 class DDGs and the Renhai class CGs are fitted with the variant of the PRC's newest ASCM, the YJ-18A, which has a range of 290 nautical miles. And a few modernized destroyers have been retrofitted with the supersonic YJ-12, which has a range of 270 nautical miles. And next generation frigates will also receive that. May also receive that missile. 8 of the plan's 12 Kilo class SSNs are equipped with the Russian-built SSN-27 Bravo, which is what we mentioned previously. That has a range of 120 nautical miles. And the Song class diesel SS and the Yuan class SSP, the Shang class SSN, field the plan's newest domestic submarine-launched ASCM, the YJ-18, which is an improvement over the SSN-27 ASCM. So, and of course, they also mentioned that, as we've mentioned previously, they're developing a launcher that can fit the YJ-18, That's the one with the 290 nautical mile range into a commercial shipping container, and so they can like covertly aboard merchant ships.
That's
Right. So
incredible.
yes, yes, it's absolutely scandalous that this has happened. It's one thing to be outranged by aging Soviet weaponry that has outranged Harpoon for the last like 40 or 50 years. This is all new stuff, right? If you look up the SSN 27, right, that has 120 nautical miles. Okay, that's 40 nautical miles roughly more than Harpoon. This is way, 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 way more, right? The problem is with all of
This is so based. I'm sorry.
I know that's an amazing photograph. It's ridiculous.
It's an artist render, but like based. Sorry, I just that's the like 8-year-old boy in me is like, war is so fucking cool.
Yeah, let's put missiles into a container ship. Yeah, that's great. So, what is the whole point of this? The whole point of this is that in surface warfare, the United States Navy is outnumbered and it is outranged by almost every conceivable metric in terms of missiles. And this isn't even counting putting these missiles onto aircraft, which obviously putting a anti-ship cruise missile on an aircraft gives you increased range for all of these missiles operationally, so you can travel faster and further with an aircraft than you can with a ship. At least in the short term, it takes a lot longer and it's a lot more predictable for a ship's movements. So if you want to see what this looks like on a map, they do have a map for this. So Prude, if you would like to scroll down, let me find it so I can give you the exact page number here of what exactly all this looks like. The first page you could look at. No, that's all ballistic missile. Sorry.
Well, you got this page 79. I have it on screen.
Yeah, that's a good map. I wasn't talking about that map. If you want to look at the ballistic missile map, which might actually give people a little bit more of an idea, that would be on page 87 in the PDF.
Can do. Oops. There you go.
So the biggest missile that is a ballistic missile, we didn't really get into it, but it's the H6 missile. Or no, wait, that's the Chinese. Sorry, that the H6J is the Chinese Marpat. That's the NATO code name is a Badger, I think. And basically, what they're talking about here is you have a air launched cruise missile attached with an aircraft, and that's the furthest ring out that you see, the furthest golden ring. That's 5,500 kilometers. So you can have an aircraft. It's a jet engine aircraft, and you can get that far of range, right? So you can see that goes the entirety of the second island chain into Australia and all of the South China Sea and well into the Indian Ocean, as well as the Strait of Malacca. Anyone who saw our Strait of Malacca stream understands exactly. And you can see even their mid-range missiles, at least for ballistic missiles, are all roughly the Strait of Malacca.
Right, they're max.
They're right there.
That's not a coincidence. Not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that their short-range missiles all have coverage over Taiwan, all have coverage over the entirety of the South China Sea, all have coverage along the eastern Japanese seaboard. Right? None of that is a coincidence.
And it can all cover the first island chain. Can hit Japan. Can hit anything that we've got. Near Vietnam, and then of course coverage towards the Philippines. Then the long range stuff can hit most of western Australia.
Also,
yeah, Strait of Malacca.
Notice their 4,000 kilometer missiles are just right enough to hit the Suez Canal and the Gulfs there.
Yep. If I wanted to fuck up global supply chains, this is the way I do it. Because look even those mid range missiles, Strait of Hormuz. Let's totally fuck up the corridor here in Afghanistan. Strait of Malacca. All
Oh, okay.
Western exports.
Okay, I found the better map actually. So yeah, this is just for their ballistic missiles, right? And the ballistic missile, like the DF-17, is incredibly important. That's the anti-ship, or yeah, that's a land attack missile. They can use that for ship purposes, right? The JH-7A is anti-ship cruise missile. All of that stuff is incredibly important. But the DF-17 is a huge deal because, and of course all of the other DF missile variants are a huge deal because they can all reach Yokosuka, right? The port next to Tokyo, Osaka, all of the US military bases in Japan, the Japanese military bases themselves, Okinawa, all of that stuff is reachable with these missiles. So you can effectively have a cruise missile come down right on top of a carrier, or not a cruise missile, a ballistic missile come down right on top of a carrier, put a hole through the flight deck, maybe cause a fire. That carrier is now out of action. How do you have a carrier? What is the point of having a carrier if the flight deck isn't operational?
Well, let me ask you this. Let's say they took a carrier out of operation. What happens to a carrier strike group if the carrier is hit? I mean, effectively, all of this entire military apparatus is really aimed at sinking. How many fleet carriers do we have? Is it 12?
We have
Yeah, it's 11. It's
11.
11 or 12, yeah. 11 or 12, yeah.
They're basically 11 or 12 ships in the world that all this is aimed at, because the whole point would be take out the fleet carrier, right? And then what is the point of the strike group?
You don't even need to sink it. You don't even
No.
need to sink it. This is what is called mission kill in military terminology. And the point, what you're trying to do is to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, right? And if you're a carrier, the whole point of fighting is the flat top. It's called a flat top because it has a flat top and a bunch of aircraft sitting on top of it that you can launch. And if you blow up the flight deck, you're done. That is now a useless ship. That means that ship now has to go back into port, be stuck there for however long it takes to effect repairs, however many days, weeks, months. You can now target it, especially if it's in Japan, right, with another missile, because it's now stuck there for a very, very long period of time. So yeah, it's no go.
Of course, the carriers are critical to the entire U.S. strategy because
Yes.
otherwise it has no means to project air power here. So,
Yes.
And without the carrier, it certainly can't affect any sort of amphibious assault.
This is why Aegis was developed in the first place. Why the integrated system between the spy radar, all of the fire control systems, the SM-2 missile, the VLS system on the Ticonderoga class and the Arleigh Burke class DDG, which followed it, were all developed in the first place, was so that enemy missiles, especially when they're launched from surface platforms, are not going to be able to penetrate my air defenses, and are not going to be able to sink or achieve mission kill on my carrier, because carriers are, according to U.S. doctrine, the decisive arm of naval combat. What does this mean? Because ballistic missiles are very difficult to kill, and of course the report mentions that as well, you have the situation where you can kill the decisive arm of U.S. doctrine without actually having to engage it in peer-to-peer combat.
Right. Well, this gets into their entire military strategy of turning the inferior to the superior or exploiting asymmetric advantages. So there's no need to ever actually engage the carrier in combat. You can also turn the carrier, which is America's biggest strength, into its greatest weakness, basically, because everything has to be designed around protecting this one asset, and the asset becomes so important that its loss cripples the entire possibility of projecting power.
Yes.
So that's exactly within their doctrine.
Yes. And this is all what they call area denial, right? So I would like to move on to page 144. This is the last thing I want to talk about for tonight. This is the better map. I think it's PDF page 162. There we go. So there's the actual map with the ranges of all of the Chinese missiles. So you've got the purple line, which is a naval surface-to-air missile. You have the gold line, which is a variant of a surface-to-air missile. You've got the red line, which is a lot of their ballistic missiles, right? Their shorter range ballistic missiles. So the red line that you saw on the previous map is the same red line here. That's how far it extends past Taiwan. And then you can see the gray line, or I should say the black line. That's the land-based missile systems that they have. The green line is, again, more mobile land-based strategic surface-to-air missiles. So they have coverage over 25% of Taiwan or 40% of Taiwan with their land-based missiles. The black line is their mobile land-based missiles, which cover 75% of Taiwan. So you can see this is not even their surface missiles. This is just their air surface to air missiles, right? This isn't even their ship missiles. This is how much coverage they have over Taiwan, just to start off with. So if you were the Chinese, right, what you would do, especially with all of your amphibious forces, you would invade Taiwan from the west, because that is the closest point of departure for you. It's where you have full coverage with your land-based surface-to-air missiles. You find a place, you send in your special forces and do what the Russians did in Ukraine with Kiev, and you send them in. You take an airport, you send in your normal infantry forces on the beach. You have those two forces link up, take a port. You bring in your Chinese maritime militia after you've captured that port, and then you start ferrying your divisions across using normal maritime militia boats, your little fishing boats or dual purpose fishing boats, basically. And you do kind of a reverse Dunkirk here. The United States, if it's going to help Taiwan, is going to be extremely limited in what it can give in terms of aid, just to start off with, because of this geographic picture here. Any aid that we give to Taiwan is going to really be limited because of the Chinese missile defenses here, both in their short and medium range surface-to-air missiles, to this little bottom tip of the island. This little tiny bottom tip of the island.
The eastern part's geography is very mountainous as well, so...
Yes, and that's very mountainous, so you can imagine there might be port infrastructure there. Maybe not. But in either case, it's very easy for the Chinese, once they've defeated the Taiwanese Navy. You can see this ship right here. You just bring some of your forces down to the north of the island and maybe slightly a little further to the south of the northeast of the island. And then you bring your other forces towards the southern tip of the island. You just cover it with air defenses. That means no more aircraft coming in. That means no more long-range American supplies that can be flown into any sort of Taiwanese airport that is either constructed there or already exists there, maybe. And it also means, because maybe if there's no port infrastructure there, you have the ability to fight the United States on the eastern seaboard of Taiwan once you've defeated the Taiwanese Navy. And the disparity between the Taiwanese Navy and the Chinese Navy, it's a pushover, right? There's no contest, really, in terms of numbers or even quality. But this will be a very easy conquest if and when China decides to take it, despite American aid. And it's also a reason why I am of the opinion that if push really comes to shove and the Chinese just do decide to invade, the United States is not going to be able to do the strategy that it tried in Ukraine. It's not going to be able to give mountains of monetary and military aid to Taiwan because it just won't be logistically feasible. This whole island can be covered by surface-to-air missiles, either land-based or, depending on how the Chinese maneuver their fleet, they will cover it with their seaborne forces, and they'll also have their aircraft carriers that will give them, and their land-based aircraft, giving them full fighter coverage over the whole island. So any attempt to resupply Taiwan and attempt to prolong this conflict is not going to happen at all. So what I think is going to happen is if the Chinese take Taiwan, the United States is by necessity going to have to be obligated to fight here.
Yeah, and well, the only answer the United States really has to any of this is for Taiwan to be able to defeat the initial Chinese assault, so that some sort of massive amphibious force could arrive on the island, which would then be subject to all of the missile attacks. We've seen what happens in the war in Ukraine when you're in range of ballistic missile systems. Bad things happen to you. The thing about Taiwan too is like almost everything is just on the western coast. I mean, the east coast is mountainous. I was actually just looking at the southern tip. It might be worth looking at this on Google Maps if you wanted, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of port infrastructure down there. There's a little bit, but if China takes the western coast of Taiwan, they've essentially taken Taiwan, and the only thing there is at that point is basically invading the giant national park. And obviously, the Americans could gum that up with special forces and airborne units and stuff, but you're not going to win that war, right? If the Chinese take the western part of the island, the western third, really, in the first few days or 2 weeks, let's say, the war would basically be over at that point.
I mean, well, again, it goes back to that Davidson window, where like the timelines between China versus the United States, and the real question becomes during this whole kerfuffle that's happening right now. There's a guy I follow. His name's Huntsman on Twitter. He's really good because he covers logistics. He's kind of a China hawk, but I mean, he's just like the gamble that you have to take with these things is what does the Chinese do in the meantime? I don't think that the Chinese are going to launch an attack in the middle of this, but they're definitely going to test the waters to see how quickly we respond to everything going on in Ukraine and Israel. And now with so much of our fleet now moved towards the Mediterranean, well, what do we do now with the Pacific? That's another reason why I wanted to talk about this in the midst of everything going on, because this report's really interesting to me in that respect too.
So I just Googled the east coast of Taiwan. I pulled it up on Google Maps, and there's a couple different. I mean, there's multiple cities and towns on the east coast, but there's only a couple of cities that look like they might have blue water, deep water port infrastructure. So like there's Taitung, there's Hualien, there's Tuchang. Those are all on the east coast, and then just north of Taipei, which is more on the west coast, you have Keelung City on the northeastern part of the island, which is by New Taipei City. It's in the Rifang district, which next to the Wanli district. I'm just looking at it right now, but basically, so you have maybe one place on the entire eastern seaboard that is out of range of both of these Chinese land-based missile systems. Then you have maybe 3 that are out of range of both land-based missile systems, and you have an additional 1 that's in range of both that is sort of out of the way because it's on the northern tip, that if you needed to, you could use it in emergency. But anyway, the point is that geographically, this is a lost battle, essentially.
Well, yeah, and I'm of the opinion that this battle's never actually going to happen. I think China's aim to have Taiwan, be part of China by 2049 is not going to involve any actual military invasion. It's just going to involve having such an obvious, overwhelming advantage in basically every domain that the U.S. is just going to opt out and take the humiliation on the face. I mean, I think that's their aim. That might not happen. But
I would agree. I would think that the problem is that the United States will have to take that humiliation, or else it will have to choose to fight.
It's lose-lose for the U.S.
Yes, and especially by 2049.
Right. I mean, we're talking about right now. It looks like the Chinese would win this fight, right?
I would agree that they would win. I think that they would. My reason for saying that is because you have discussions of admirals in at various fleet commands, even like 10 years ago, who you hear talking about how China is now a peer-to-peer adversary in the South China Sea, about how China is a possibly worthy opponent now. And that has been something that is long-standing at this point. That's a 10 years old gouge. That's 10 years old information. So what does it look like now? The situation has not improved. I guarantee you that.
And goodness knows that some of the information in here are probably conservative estimates or even overestimations to information that may be classified, that the Chinese have not made public or that the Chinese have lied about, similarly to how what we say on Wikipedia is the real answers are classified. But with that, let's wrap up here and ask both of you two gentlemen, starting with Mr. Mandrill. What were your overall thoughts and impressions, and what should be the key takeaways from this report?
Do you really want me to answer that question?
In 2 sentences, yes.
How fucked are you now? How fucked are you now? How fucked are we now? We're surely fucked now.
There you go. Charlemagne.
Yeah, there's not much to say other than that the report is fine, but how is the US going to counter any of this? Because as I've pointed out, it seems to be doing the opposite of what you would want to do if you actually wanted to respond to this in a militarily coherent way. So, reports all fine and good, but what's going to be done about it? Absolutely nothing. Or the Chinese will just be helped. I mean, I'm also, sort of 50-50 on, we're not really in any actual contest in China at the highest levels. But, that could be argued either way.
I share a similar feeling that this report's a really interesting look at how we tell Congress, our legislating body, here's some more. It's like the meme with like the deadbeat black guy like hugging his woman or whatever. It's like, go get my purse. It's like, well, how do you report to the people that are going to go get their purse, and how would you talk about it? And it's interesting to see how it's laid out. I think that the way that the Chinese are breaking down their look at multi-domain warfare and maximizing their weaknesses into ways that can be strengths, and to play against the asymmetrical kind of warfare that even the West has been playing. This does feel like how, I guess, some staffers in the Department of Defense would write up a report to the American Congress after reading, some classified data and maybe unrestricted warfare. But the question becomes, what is America doing to respond to this? And I'm not, like both of us have already, you guys have said, I'm not optimistic either. But there were just 2 super chats that came in real quick. One of them was from Melisma for US $10. He just says, thanks for the stream. Well, thank you so much. Your ongoing support is greatly appreciated, both with super chats and on Subscribestar, Entropy, Substack, Buy Me a Coffee, etc. And then Zood for $5 US says, priority alert, Israel's invasion has begun, fighting along the border as they enter the strip. Yeah, there was some
it's fucking happening.
The it's happening gang finally gets a W today, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh, I thought it wasn't going to happen. I thought they were going to cuck and back down, but I guess not.
But yeah, so I guess we'll be covering that in a few days, I imagine, either on the Old Glory Club or on our own various channels and Substacks and such. But I just realized I had the sunglasses version of my profile picture on the entire time. That's
didn't
okay.
realize that?
No, that's okay. I'll take those glasses off now. I have so many profile images that I use to react to Geo, and please be patient with me. I have autism. It's okay. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for tuning in. But before we go away, for sure, where can we find you 2 wonderful people? Mr. Mandrill, what are you up to? What do you do? What are you doing?
I just wrote an article for the Old Glory Club this week. It had some pretty good engagement. It was called Black Rifle Coffee Company Nationalism, Brick Nationalism, and it was my kind of thoughtful response to BAP's article from a year or two ago about the war in Ukraine, and I tied it in with Israel and Ukraine and the signs and symbols of how people who hate you will what they will use in order to get you to do things against your interests. So if that appeases to you, it's very short. Go read it. It's on the OGC. It's not behind the paywall or nothing. Speaking of the paywall, we at the Old Glory Club have been doing a lot of horror streams that are behind the paywall. And so if everybody wants to go watch streams because it is spooky season, podcasts, you can find my podcast from a couple weeks back with Proper Horror Show. And we also had the luxury, Charlemagne and I, of doing a episode podcast with Thomas 777 discussing the movie Prometheus. And a lot of people didn't like that movie, but I think we did a good job of showing it in a different light.
Yeah, that Prometheus stream was fantastic. I highly recommend that people go check it out, support the OGC. Charlemagne, what are you up to, man?
Well, right now I'm mostly just trying to not freeze after getting dumped on by snow. So I'm up to very little in terms of e-write stuff at the moment. I'm halfway through a book review. Just did that Prometheus stream with Thomas on the Old Glory Club Substack. Definitely, I thought that was a great review. It accomplished everything I really wanted to. I think it's worth subscribing to the Old Glory Club's Substack to get access to the podcast we have out there right now. Do I have anything in the works other than trying to be attentive to my blog? Not really. Just follow me on Twitter at CharlesMain69, where I'll be in Mr. D's space in like a half hour or so.
Yeah, we'll all be there. We'll all be at Mr. D's Friday night cocktail hour Twitter Spaces. Yes, go subscribe to the Old Glory Club. I have been busy away on Substack. I was on Last Things' stream yesterday talking about what constitutes sort of an American Abbasia with identity. It was a fun hour and a half long conversation. I just recorded with him as well with this Last Things picture show, or the Last Picture Show. We talked about Kurosawa's Redbeard. It's one of my favorite Kurosawa films of all time. And then I have a 4-part series with Oren McIntyre on Joseph de Maistre and the study on sovereignty. So we cover both books, book 1 and 2 on sovereignty. It's really great stuff. Advocating for total theory, cell death, and the ways in which you can kill a king. It's really great, spicy stuff from a French reactionary. And then I have my own video out on genetic bottlenecks and civilizational bottlenecks that you can go watch right after this. And more great stuff to come, but subscribe to the Old Glory Club. All 3 of us write and appear on Pony Express Radio on Thursdays. Subscribe, like, share, and all that. And we will see you all next time.